Paul Fidalgo of the Center for Inquiry, and I'm here to talk podcasts. Well, one podcast in particular, Point of Inquiry. It's a production of the Center for Inquiry, and for 15 years, Point of Inquiry has tackled the big questions in science, religion, politics, and culture. Our hosts, Leanne Lord and Jim Underdown, take on a wide range of tough and timely topics, specializing in the things that you're not supposed to talk about at the dinner table, because these are the topics that matter. For example, right now, anti-vaxxers and QAnon dominate the news and are actively making our world less safe. So, Point of Inquiry explored conspiracy theories from the inside with a former 9/11 truther, Stephanie Kemmerer, to figure out how a mind gets sucked down the rabbit hole and how to get it out again. We've talked astrophysics with Neil deGrasse Tyson, science education with Bill Nye, bioethics with Francis Collins, mass extinction with Elizabeth Kolbert, and dozens of other important topics with fascinating guests. There are 15 years worth of interviews available through our archive, so you'll never run out of new things to discover. Check out Point of Inquiry on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And visit our website at pointofinquiry.org to learn more about the show and explore everything else going on at the Center for Inquiry.
And welcome everyone. I'm so glad to see such a great turnout for this conversation. So today I want to welcome you all and also welcome our conversation facilitator, Michelle Churia. She is a member of the Ethical Society of St. Louis. She leads our We Thinks Good Philosophy Club. The Philosophy Club meets on the first and third Saturdays of the month. All are welcome. She's also a visiting scholar at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. She completed her PhD at York University in Toronto and then held postdoctoral fellowships at Washington University in St. Louis and the University of New South Wales in Sydney. She's the author of An Intersectional Feminist Theory of Moral Responsibility and an all-around wonderful human being. Please join me in welcoming Michelle Churia. She will lead today's discussion on science and objectivity.
Thank you, Louise. Okay, so if you don't recognize me, I'm the host of a public philosophy group at the Ethical Society of St. Louis, and today I'm combining that group's meeting with my presentation to the Secular Student Alliance. And the presentation will be more of a forum with the same format as the public philosophy group, meaning that I'll present a brief introduction to a philosophical topic and then invite all of you to share your thoughts. So the topic I chose for today is Sandra Harding's theory of objectivity, which is in the field of feminist social epistemology. And it's supposed to address secular science's legacy of racism, sexism, and ableism. So Harding writes about how in the past, scientists would defend unethical theories and practices like eugenics on grounds that they were being objective and impartial and not engaging in politics or responding to political pressures. And they would also tend to say that governments and the public shouldn't interfere in science because this would undermine the objectivity and value neutrality of their research. So in general, feminists reject this understanding of science because they tend to think that everything is essentially political. So good theories and practices are not value neutral and apolitical, but rather informed by good values and politics, like the values of gender equality and racial justice. So I chose this topic because I feel it bridges the interests of the Ethical Society and the Secular Student Alliance by linking science and ethics and explaining how we can potentially make science more ethical. So that's my reason for choosing the topic. So this is how the meeting should go today. I'm going to start by asking you to answer a poll on science and objectivity. And oh, I think you can see it. It just came up on my screen. So it's just 5 questions with yes, no, and maybe answers. So I'll have you respond to this poll, and then we'll discuss the results of the poll. Then I'm going to show you a brief video explaining Sandra Harding's theory of objectivity. It's just a video I found on YouTube, and it's basically like someone giving this concise definition of strong objectivity. So we'll discuss that. And then if there's time, I'll ask if any of you can think of examples of weak objectivity in science. So like scientific research or theories that don't live up to the standard of strong objectivity today. So yeah, so that's basically the format. And I'll just let you now take the poll, and then we can discuss your answers.
Excuse me, but at least on my screen, the 3rd question isn't complete. It just says, are there similarities between science and
religion? It should say similarities between science and religion. And I can read the question. So the first question is scientific research objective? The second question is science good for society? The third question is, are there similarities between science and religion? Question number 4, does diversity within scientific communities, for example, more women, people of color, produce better scientific research? And number 5, do all standpoints contribute to objectivity, or are some standpoints relatively useless?
That's a little unclear. Are you wanting to just respond to the first half? Do all standpoints contribute to objectivity?
There's a scroll bar.
Yeah.
There's a scroll bar there.
This is the first poll I've taken where there's a scroll bar and there's more below. That's never happened in my experience before.
Yes, and you'll have to answer all the questions before you can submit the poll. And right now we have 60% of our participants who have already submitted their answers. So let's give it a couple more minutes. Oh, it shot up to 72. This poll has officially been launched for 3 minutes. Doesn't it feel like so much longer than that?
Oh yeah, I guess because we're silent. Maybe that's maybe I gave too many questions.
No, you're fine.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got 87% of the people have answered. Do we want to go ahead and end the poll? So last call for poll answers. Get your answers in now. We're getting ready to end that poll. Okay, and let's share the results.
Okay, interesting. So can everyone see the results? Is scientific research objective? Most people said maybe. Is science good for society? Most people said yes. Are there similarities between science and religion? Most people said no. Does diversity produce better scientific research? Most people said yes. And do all standpoints contribute to objectivity? Most people said maybe. Okay, interesting. So I guess I'll start with, is scientific research objective? Does anyone who said yes want to explain why they said that?
And you can unmute yourselves. So feel free to unmute yourselves and answer.
That's 31% said yes. Okay, what about people who said no? Does anyone who said no want to respond? Or just any perspectives are actually, does anyone want to explain want to explain their answer to that question?
Marty, go ahead.
I answered maybe. I'm a scientist in the field of social sciences and mostly having to do with brain and psychology. And so I said maybe because of the fact that being in the business for 50 years, I've seen really lousy research and things that are not necessarily biased by the examiners, but they're just poor designs. And then you run across a tremendously biased research that's paid for by pharmaceutical companies or paid for by the tobacco industry or by the petroleum industry. And then you have sciences, I think, that are biased by the fact that they're tremendously gender influenced by the fact that the perspective is either male or female, and they have something they want to prove. So I said maybe because of those questions that come up regarding real objectivity.
Yeah, those are good examples. Yeah, good.
I answered no precisely for those same reasons.
Right.
So, but for me, that's a vehement no.
Good, good.
I answered yes. I answered yes, and because scientific research should be objective, otherwise it's not science.
Okay, okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that was my reasoning too, is that when I was taught scientific research, that was the whole idea, was to be objective. So now, of course, there are things that are not objective when people who are doing it, but that's not the science. That's not the fault of the method.
And I answered maybe because I think most of us in academia know about publication bias, that research that has a negative, that the hypothesis is proved false, are much less likely to get published and therefore spread to other people than those where the hypothesis is proved positive. So even if the researcher intended to not be biased, the published results are biased.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking we were referring to the so-called physical sciences. And if we're not, then I think there is a lot more room for bias to be interjected when you have social sciences or applying scientific method to sociological and kinds of theses.
Right. Yeah.
When I said no. When you come, whenever you are observing something, you are the one who is taking that in and processing that information, and so by its very nature, that is, whether you're doing it consciously or not, you are making judgments about what is going on. Whatever you're looking at, whether it's data from microscopy or data from social sciences, or just yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's good. That's
So I kind of agree with what was just said. Sometimes maybe the research is not objective because, you know, everybody has different hypotheses, and while you're doing the research, it's not objective, but the goal of the research is to get an objective answer or result. So you know, if you start applying to different scenarios, eventually you get to an objective result, but the research itself is not objective.
good.
Well, I said maybe. As we know, there's a big difference between should and is. So, well, science at its best should be objective, like Chevy said. But is science objective? It depends on who you ask, or it depends on who is doing the science. You know, who scientists who say that climate change is a hoax, that Black people are less intelligent, women are less, and so on. You know, so we have is, you know, what we have out there. Unfortunately, a lot of it is not objective, but it should be objective. But it's, you know.
Yeah. Good.
I would agree with all those maybes in the last comments. It's eventually self-correcting because it's subject to criticism and critique by other scientists, and is open to correction. So it's the best method we have. It's the most objective method we have, I think. It just doesn't always work well.
Yeah, good. Okay. So does anyone else want to contribute on that question?
I just kept thinking about the studies that are sponsored by someone with a particular point of view, like the ones that said smoking is not harmful, not addictive. Hopefully it doesn't happen as much now.
Right. Yeah. There is a lot of corporate sponsorship in science. Right. So that could maybe bias the scientific scientific research. Good point. Okay. I guess we can move on to the next question. Is science good for society? So anyone can.
Overwhelmingly, 88% of you said yes.
Yeah.
And no one said no. And only 12% said maybe. So you want to share your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll jump in here real quick and then let everybody else add their good comments. I voted yes because, like Dr. Scott said, Bob Scott, it is Stewart, sorry. It is the best we have to try to describe cause and effect that we have, I think, in the world today. And therefore, we have to trust it better than we just do experience and opinion. And when groups get together and figure out they know the truth. So I voted that it's good because if you look around at the way life was, say 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, 100 years ago, the major difference in the way we live today often is relative to the scientific discoveries, particularly in health and wellness, and in understanding cause and effect in the way our world does with natural disasters. These are the things that have made our life longer, better, and with less suffering. So that's why I said it usually does good, but it doesn't always. But I would say it's the best we have, just like Dr. Stewart did.
Good. Any other comments?
I think it's important to realize that while science has given us all of these advancements over thousands of years of human history, I think it's also important to realize that it's also given us some less than flattering developments, such as nuclear weapons, or really just about every weapon of warfare is also a product of science. And I think broadly we would agree here that war generally is bad.
Yes, right. So yeah, so it gives us these military technologies that could potentially be used for evil. And that's something that Sandra Harding does write about as well.
I'd like to respond to that. To me, science is not doesn't have an ethical value. It's not intrinsically good or bad. It's a way of learning. It's a way of experimenting. What humans do with knowledge is when ethics comes in. And so whether we use scientific knowledge to better society or to cause wars isn't the fault of science, it's the fault of us as humans.
Yes.
Yeah, I would agree.
I would agree with that because eventually then through trial and error, we learn what works and what doesn't work.
Yes, I voted maybe on that one because the worst thing would happen, I mean a bad thing, I imagine would be a scientist who finds something and says, oh no, I shouldn't publish this because it won't benefit society. I think that would be pretty bad.
Good. Okay.
And I thought of criminal anthropology, which someone brought up earlier, which was a terrible science and did a lot of harm in the world. But then also some of the things you mentioned, how science has, you know, furthered quality of life and longevity of life and minimalized suffering.
Good. Okay. So,
yeah.
maybe oh yeah, Tom.
Yeah, I thought of the eugenics movement, which turned out to be very horrible, and they tried to base it on science. And my God, save us from scientists like that.
Right.
What I've noticed, just in speaking, in hearing everyone speak, is that it's, for the most part, we are not objecting to the science itself so much as we are discussing the positives and negative, the positive and negative applications of said science. So I'm not necessarily, that's more just an observation than anything.
Okay. Yeah, the applications of science. Sandra Harding does talk about scientific theories, scientific principles, scientific methods, and how these can be developed in positive or negative ways. And I guess they're intrinsic to science. So you could have some, I mean, like eugenics was a scientific theory, for example. You could have methods that are unethical within science, like experimenting on people. So I guess not just the application or like the research methods, but like the theories and principles could also be potentially unethical. Yeah, but that's a good point that, yeah, a lot depends on the application of it.
You know, you mentioned experimenting on humans. You know, we might say that from a scientific viewpoint, probably experimenting on humans would yield the best results. So, you know, if we want to try new vaccines instead of using animals, when you get false results, like in 90% of the cases, from a pure scientific standpoint, would be why we should experiment directly on humans, because then we get the best results. So that might be a case of an unethical, most of us would agree it'd be an unethical thing to do, but strictly as a scientist, why it would be the natural thing to do. And of course, that's what the Nazis did, and others. So in that sense, I guess I'd say maybe. In that case, it's not good.
And Bill, I know that you're an animal rights activist because you come to the Ethical Society meeting. So you might even want to call into question if we should be using non-human animals in scientific research, or is that also unethical?
I would say it is, at least in any case where it depends if you're utilitarian or not, but I would side with the people who say it's always unethical. If Melody were here, she would jump in with that too.
going to chime in here, if you don't mind. I'm kind of piggybacking off of Bev's comment in the chat. So the thing is, a lot of the experimentation does disproportionately affect people from the global south and marginalized communities. As it's important to acknowledge this when we're going in with a perspective of diversity and realizing that the majority of people who benefit from these experiments and these procedures are part of the global north and also part of Western developed democracies. So it's kind of something to put in perspective because it makes you understand who is being sacrificed for whose benefit. And I'm an animal rights activist too. I've been vegan for 10 plus years, but you cannot dismiss the suffering of marginalized communities by trying to uphold animals when there are people going through the same thing.
Good.
Then on the other end of this, you might consider clinical trials and the ethical ramifications of those in both of these thought spaces we're talking about here.
Yeah.
I think informed consent is really important too. So to me, I feel like non-human animals cannot really give you informed consent. And some people cannot even really give you informed consent. So that's a slippery place to be in.
Good. Okay, so I guess we can go on to another question. I don't know if I want to do the one about religion right now. Because I want to see how much time there is. Why don't we go to number 4? Does diversity within scientific communities produce better scientific research, like more objective scientific research? What do people think? Most people said yes. And then there were some maybes and 2% no. So yeah, so feel free to share on that question.
I know there have been studies done where diversity cultivates creativity. So I would say, I don't know about objectivity, but the more perspectives we have, diversity is a value that strengthens us. So the more perspectives we have, I feel the better the science will be.
Right.
So are you saying you come up with like different hypotheses to test because there are different people are coming from different cultural viewpoints or something like that?
Yes, or even a perspective that I might not appreciate or notice because of my upbringing and background.
I would add that I like kind of the way that Michael Polanyi wrote about this in his book, Personal Knowledge. And that is that we all see meaning in different combinations in nature and in words and all these things. And if you have just one select group who tend to have a lot of cultural similarities, noticing what could be meaningful in a scientific field, then it gets limited. But the more diversity you have with that, both racially, gender, and the way they were raised, even age, and even educational levels, they see different things in the same patterns, whether they're nature or words or whatever is being studied. So that's why I voted yes for diversity.
Yeah, similar to Sandra Harding's position. Yeah.
I agree that there's positivity in diversity when you're seeking a multidisciplinary solution to a complex problem, right? And this is the sort of thing that's taught to researchers as someone who's been going through that recently. But as with all things, it comes down to who's financing it. So, scientific research processes in medicine are, considered, there's a metaphor like it's a pipeline, and the idea that you can go through all of these different stages in the study, and a lot of them are predictably going to fail, and then you go on to the next stage and the next stage. And for all of these stages in medicine, you build a new team. Sometimes there's continuity, sometimes there's not. But often they're actually trying to address, like ultimately they're trying to address very difficult things, like deeply complicated things, like addressing diabetes, which has implications to, you know, food addiction and behavioral processes, and you know, they want to produce a medicine, but also a way to use it. Anyway, I just think it's about who pays for it as much as anything.
Yeah. Do you think that funding system, are you saying it might undermine objectivity, or?
I'm saying that it negates objectivity. I mean, my perspective is that.
Oh, okay. Like that's not like so if it's funded by a specific corporation, they just want you to get the results regardless of objectivity. Like that's not, or yeah, I'm just trying to tie it to objectivity. So I guess you're just like funded to you're funded so that you achieve a certain result, and objectivity isn't even a consideration, maybe.
Yeah, it's not objective because it's subjective, because it fits the perspective of the people who are constructing the teams and who are writing the checks.
Right. Good. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you're concerned about getting your funding or, you know, getting your grants again, you might not be so concerned with objectivity because you're focused on continuing your research, which you cannot do without the sponsorship.
But Louise, it's not just they lose objectivity. The issue is also if you have you run 100 studies through, say, a particular political institute, and they're looking for the trickle-down effect that comes in funding or something like that, what happens is they don't publish studies that go against the philosophy and mandate of the organization. They only publish studies that are supportive, and that is a terrible bias in science.
I do think we need to ask too, is coerced objectivity really objective? So.
Yeah, can you elaborate on that, Danielle?
Well, we talk about funding and we talk about, I mean, come on, money is power, right? And so if this is the field that's being funded and if this is the specific type of research, for example, we know the military gives funding to different scientific research, right? Then are you really being encouraged to be truly objective if you don't have the resources to be going outside of that?
Yeah.
That might be, but some of the bias is that I'm hearing is about how it's published. It's accepted. It's not really about science, basically, which is right. I mean, it's self-correcting as we get more evidence. You know, it's like the physicists of the world didn't accept Einstein's theory of relativities for a long time, for quite a while. I mean, he's working in a patent office, right? And he's brilliant, and he was right on most of it. But so I'm hearing a lot of criticism, which is correct, about ethics and publicity, not about the science. The fossil fuel industry's own research showed that the climate change was a problem in the 70s, but it isn't publicized that that's what they said, that they knew, until, you know, the 1990s or 2000s. I mean, I don't remember just when, because I'm 80 and I can't remember which decade things happen sometimes. But what I'm hearing is criticism of other things other than basic science. I was married for over 16 years to an astronomer at the U.S. Naval Observatory, and I'm thinking he was studying double stars with photographic light plates. And one night, and one of he saw a streak on there, and he asked his director if, you know, is that something? And his director says, no, it's just a flaw in the slide. But then pretty soon, an astronomer in France saw what they thought was the same thing, and you know, they thought it was the same satellite of Saturn, and it was published that way. I mean, R.L. Walker Jr. was in New York Times as well. He was credited with confirming it. He could have reported it first, but in astronomy, because you can't do another test around the globe doing the same thing most of the time, you have to have it confirmed. But once we had telescopes that go closer, we found out that they were separate satellites. You know, so they thought there were 10 instead of 9, and the science book said 9, and we were taught, but it didn't mean that 9 was really wrong, or that Pluto, I mean, what they thought when Pluto was a planet. Well, this was the description. Now we find out that there's other objects that are bigger, that, you know, you just can't count them all as planets. They're way out there. We just didn't know they were there. We know more, but I'm hearing criticism, not of real science.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. Neil, you have your hand up.
Yeah, and so to jump on the objectivity, I know this is a recent NPR episode, but I'll go to it because I'm sure it's not, you know, unique. But it was describing how in fertility the egg plays so much more of a role than we're, so to speak, taught. We're taught the sperm seeks out and the sperm does this and the sperm does this, when really there's a much more active role that the egg is playing. And that's been known for decades, but that's not the science taught in the textbooks, because it was a bunch of old white men who put together the science, so to speak, on fertility in the 50s and 60s. So I think absolutely it has to do with diversity and objectivity. And of course that comes to sexes, and of course that comes to race and ethnic background, socioeconomic background. But when you're coming from it with just a particular viewpoint, you're going to see a particular answer and not the diversity of answers that should be considered and weighed. Even if someone is trying to weigh those answers objectively, they're not going to have all the options to choose from if they only come from that one background.
Yeah, that's a good example, Neil. Thanks. Maybe, okay, let's move on just because of time considerations to number 5. Do all standpoints contribute to objectivity, or are some standpoints relatively useless? What do you think? All standpoints, all perspectives, all social positions, are they all valuable to science? And this one's pretty divided in terms of your answers.
Well, I'm going to say yes, absolutely. I am a social scientist, so please hold your critique. But especially in the social sciences, making sure everybody is in the room, and this includes people who are not necessarily with formal education, you know, because there's something to be said about lived experiences, and, you know, anecdotes are one thing, but also if we have the ivory tower where we're not really in contact with, you know, the people living this day to day, there's a piece of that missing in the research.
Good. Any other comments?
I'm going to voice the opposite point of view, Mish. I'm not a scientist, but I am an engineer. And so what I share with scientists is that we deal with hard facts and data. And it's frustrating when people that come from a non-technical background come into our environment and they're put in decision-making positions, but they're making those decisions without the full technical knowledge of exactly what it is they're making decisions about. In my own case, I'm a medical device design engineer, and I've seen instances where my own ideas for device improvement, as well as other engineers' ideas for improvements to the product, improvements that would make this medical product better for customers, right? This is not trivial stuff. These ideas get shot down because non-technical people don't understand them.
Yeah, interesting. That sort of reminds me of how in academia, some politicians are saying that people can't teach certain subjects such as critical race theory. And these politicians are have no background in philosophy or critical theory, but they're saying professors can't teach critical race theory. So they don't really have the expertise or lived experience even to kind of make that judgment and impose that on professors. So yeah, I guess in some cases, in some cases people can contribute in a negative way. Maybe something like that is happening in your field.
And I just like to make a response, although I'm an avid supporter of free speech and believe that people should have the right to speak their beliefs as to whether they're valuable. When you look at all, for example, the huge number of QAnon followers who absolutely believe in something that the sources are anonymous and therefore can't be vetted or checked. They're making political, economic, and medical decisions based on non-facts, or at least non-verifiable facts. I think those are dangerous. And then when they're claiming that science and mainstream media is all fake, that is dangerous because it is influencing our leaders and influencing other people to make decisions disregarding verifiable research and scientific knowledge.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, and I think what people are touching on is, like, on one hand, we need input from all the stakeholders, but then on the other hand, not everybody is acting in good faith, and not everybody has the expertise needed to make an informed decision and give informed suggestions.
And all of our senses are at risk here. It's like our brain interprets things differently based on our backgrounds and what we're doing. And optical illusions are, I mean, we know, I think just about everybody's seen something they know wasn't really like what it looked like. Well, all our senses are like that. So taking a vote of people with their perceptions doesn't come out with really accurate reality, views of reality. And I have a problem with that. And that's why science, like physics and chemistry, which we used to call science, those kinds of things, try to use machines because they understand that we're all biased. And the scientists know that. That's why they have to have confirming and are always trying to prove themselves wrong. It's like, I remember reading in Discover magazine in the 1990s where they said that there isn't anything that a physicist would like more than to prove Einstein wrong. But the religion and the opinions tends to reinforce what we already thought we knew.
Good.
I have a question for the group, Michelle. Maybe we could talk a little bit back because we have a lot of different opinions here. And one of the areas that's I've always struggled with, particularly when I've been teaching and trying to do research, is I know that science can do self-correction because I've seen the movement across knowledge. And if a study can't be replicated or it shows to have flaws, then usually somebody steps up and tries to do a correct kind of examination. So my question is, should it be just as important that science have correction by some of the social justice narratives, by some of the experiential narratives that people have? They're not scientific correction. They're other trends, they're other social movements, and they're other very important opinions. But scientists often don't say, well, you don't know the rules. You don't count, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering how we feel about that, whether non-scientific opinion, it isn't science, should be used to correct science.
Yeah, I could think of a specific example where, if the science says we should do this in this community, we better go talk to the people who live, eat, breathe, work in that community, because we don't know how that science applied would impact their lives. So, I think anecdotal evidence and going and seeking out perspective from all the different stakeholders is really important. I would say before you figure out the approach, but especially after, so that you can know the impact that you're going to have on the communities where you want to implement these science-based approaches.
Yeah.
I think another way of saying that is, we quite often hear the phrase, which you use, science says. Well, science isn't some big entity, like God says, the president says. Science is a method for learning. And so if we're making a decision about what to do in a particular society, we can say scientific research indicates X and Y and Z. Sociological research indicates X and Y and Z. And as we make decisions about what to do, we need to take in results from the physical sciences, results from the social sciences, and then our own ethical stances, because we can't say any, people say, science says, government says. Those are all pools of data, not mega figures.
Good. Okay, so since we're reaching the halfway point, why don't I just show you this video that summarizes Sandra Harding's view of objectivity, and then we can discuss that video. So this will basically provide answers for these questions from Sandra Harding's perspective. So I'll just share my screen.
Michelle, while you're doing that, check out the chat because there's a lot of great discussion in there.
Okay.
Okay.
I should, yeah. I'll try to do that while I'm sharing this video. Okay, so
And are you going to come back to that question you skipped?
if there's time.
Okay.
Yeah, hopefully if there's time. Okay. And I also wanted to ask if you can think of examples of science, of how science doesn't live up to the standards of strong objectivity in the present moment. But okay, let me just share this video first. So first things first here. Okay.
So two of the leading lights in this research were Sandra Harding and Helen Longino, represented here. Both Longino and Harding made an effort to reimagine objectivity as a social accomplishment. So there you see the kind of social epistemological approach coming in. The problem, they think, is that objectivity has been linked to individuals. We saw that in Popper, right? We talked about the kind of character of the scientist. The scientist is this really hard-nosed rationalist who just sort of, sticks to it and is hard-headed and so forth. And what they're saying is that, no, objectivity doesn't happen at the site of the individual researcher. The individual researcher is caught up in all kinds of social forces that, even though he's hard-headed and really sticks to the facts and so on, the sort of social character of those prejudices is going to distort his experience of the world. And so they argue that objectivity actually is a social process, a social achievement. It's achieved through the social character and procedures of scientific inquiry. Our sociality, they argue, doesn't mean that objectivity is impossible. So that's a claim that you often hear. We're sort of social creatures and we have all these social prejudices and they get in the way of us being objective. And they're not saying that there's no sense in which that happens, but they're saying that ultimately our social nature is what makes genuine objectivity possible. So it's an interesting argument. So one of the things that Sandra Harding is famous for developing is this notion of standpoint epistemology. Now this idea traces back to Marxist theory. To put it simply, the idea is that how we view matters depends to a great extent on our social position. So the position you occupy in the social world and your relative advantages, disadvantages, and so on, deeply shapes the way you understand and experience the world. So our personal experiences of privilege or disadvantage, maleness or femaleness, heteronormativity or queerness, disability or able-bodiedness influence our perspectives on and our interpretations of the world. So all things being equal, and this is kind of the core idea behind this notion that objectivity is a social achievement. All things being equal, a more diverse research community will bring to bear more perspectives on an issue than a less diverse one. And when you bring to bear more perspectives on the issue, you make the shared perspective that the social totality of the scientific research community has more objective. So this leads to Sandra Harding's very influential distinction between weak objectivity and strong objectivity. Objectivity, practiced by most scientific communities, Harding argues, is weak because of the community's homogeneity. For the vast majority of the history of science, the scientific community left out the perspectives of women, people of color, working classes, and many other groups. Basically, it left out the perspective of the vast majority of humanity. And lo and behold, we find that sexist, racist, and classist theories emerge from those communities. I asked you to read in this book pages 87 to 104, which is a kind of case study of when science can go bad. And it talks about the history of eugenics and how the theory of eugenics really got developed in America, and that this led to mass sterilization, people with mental disabilities, and that the kind of grotesque eugenic theory that was developed in the United States got picked up by the Germans. Some of the American sort of eugenicist scientists were personal heroes for Adolf Hitler. It's a really interesting discussion that Orestes offers, and I hope that you'll look at it. But what Harding is saying is that kind of theory never would have gotten off the ground if the scientific community weren't just a bunch of old white dudes. If the scientific community had all along been diverse, a kind of grotesque and simplistic and stupid theory like eugenics never would have gotten off the ground. Why? Because you would have been standing in a research community with people who didn't look just like you and share your perspective on your own superiority. And they would have said, well, interesting theory, Bob, but that's totally obviously false. Look around you. But that kind of thing couldn't happen because the research community was completely homogeneous. And so if, like Sandra Harding, you think of objectivity as being a social achievement, you would see a homogeneous community like that as one that was sort of characterized by weak objectivity, because it's not bringing to bear all the relevant perspectives on the questions that are being researched. So strong objectivity is essentially this idea that there's strength in diversity, diversity of standpoint, the standpoints that I was talking about earlier. Your standpoint, including your beliefs, values, and life experiences, those things affect your work. They affect how you see the world. They affect the kind of research that you're interested in. So the best way to develop objective knowledge is to increase the diversity of knowledge-seeking communities. So that's a core claim that Harding and Longino developed, and that has been really influential in feminist philosophy of science, but then ultimately in philosophy of science in general. And it's a very important idea right now. It's having a lot of impact. So the idea here is that objectivity is not a binary proposition. It's not a 0 or a 1. It's not like, oh, you're objective or you're not objective. Objectivity is a continuum phenomenon. It's something that's achieved in social communities, and you can have more of it or less of it. So it comes in degrees. You can have more and less objective research communities. And the idea is that the greater a community's diversity, the better its shot at achieving objectivity. Just to give you a couple of quick examples of how diversity can lead to greater objectivity. In primatology for a long time, they thought that only male apes try to have sex with multiple female partners, whereas female apes would just sort of attach to one male and try to have kids with him and raise those kids. Then more women entered the field of primatology, and they said, that's not true. Actually, female apes are interested in having sex with multiple other apes too. Another interesting one that you often hear is this idea that in hunter-gatherer societies, men hunted and women gathered. Sometimes you'll even hear these people with a background in evolutionary psychology say, well, this is why men are interested in things and they want to be engineers, and why women are interested in people and they want to go into the care professions. It's because women historically, in terms of our evolutionary development, were out there in groups, gathering, gossiping, and talking to each other, and men were out there on the savannah trying to hunt. Well, there's recent evidence that that's false and that women hunted too. And I'll link to the study that suggests that that was false. But I think the flavor of these examples is pretty straightforward. Once you diversify a research community, you get people with different perspectives and different interests who are going to look at the world in a different way. They're going to study different facets of that world. And so make different discoveries and thereby increase the objectivity of the research community. Okay, take another break and we'll come back and talk about Helen Longino.
Okay, so that is basically Sandra Harding's theory in a nutshell. So going back to the poll questions, is scientific research objective? For Sandra Harding, it's a matter of degree. So because individuals are not objective, because we all have a specific standpoint based on our social position, our experiences, our relationships. So no individual is objective. We're all subjects, and so we all have a subjective standpoint. So the research community is made up of individuals. And so it has a certain degree of objectivity depending on how objective the collective standpoint of that community is. And so if a research community is more diverse and includes people with different standpoints, it will be more objective because those people will be able to correct each other's biases and prejudices. So that's how objectivity leads to more objective research within scientific communities. That comes from a theory called standpoint epistemology, which focuses on how knowledge is rooted in subjective standpoints, essentially. So standpoint epistemology leads to this, basically, this theory of objectivity as a social accomplishment and a social process. So number 2, is science good for society? Of course, objective science is better for society, but science will, for Sandra Harding, science is only as good as the society in which it takes place. So in a Nazi society, you're going to have Nazi science. In a colonialist society, you're going to have colonialist science. So if your society is a white supremacist society, that hierarchy is going to influence the kinds of research projects that get funded and sponsored and that people express interest in, or that, you know, the ruling classes express interest in. So the science and society basically co-constitute each other. So they're enmeshed in each other. So so whether the science is good or not will depend on the politics of the surrounding culture. So I think that's basically what she would say about number 2. So there can be very bad scientific research in very oppressive cultures. Okay. So number 4, yes, so Sandra Harding thinks that diversity does improve scientific research. And just touching on what some of you have said, so she thinks that science should be democratic. So that means it should be responsive to the needs and interests and preferences of the entire culture, of the public. So science should be responsive to the public. That's how science ideally should work in a democracy. So when you have corporate interests funding and controlling science, that science will not necessarily be objective because it will not necessarily be democratic and responsive to the needs and interests and standpoints of the public. It will be controlled by a small group of elite rich people, and they have their own personal interests, their own like very narrow interests in like how they fund and govern these science projects. So yeah, so she says ideally science should be responsive to social justice and all kinds of public interests. That will make it more objective and more ethical. And number 5. Do all standpoints contribute to objectivity? It's kind of a trick question. And so you were all right, like a lot of you pointed out, I know that Danielle pointed out, for example, that many perspectives are still excluded in American scientific research, like the perspectives of the global South, for example. Many communities are marginalized in scientific research, even in the COVID vaccine clinical trials. Certain communities within the United States were underrepresented within those clinical trials, for example. So there is still marginalization in science. It's very important to include those standpoints and those communities. But Sandra Harding does say in her book that some standpoints just don't have, or some like perspectives don't have a lot of value, such as neo-Nazi perspectives or fascist perspectives. She doesn't mention this because this book was published before QAnon and before the Trump presidency, but probably QAnon would not be a valuable perspective. And she says one reason is that like we are very familiar with what neo-Nazis think. There was World War II. We're very familiar with what like fascists and white supremacists think because we live in a society that comes from colonialism, that has genocidal roots. And so we're all very familiar with these perspectives. So they don't actually add value to our scientific projects. The most important perspectives to incorporate are those of underrepresented communities, not, you know, rich white supremacists. Or, you know, not the overrepresented ones who basically were the dominant voice throughout the history of our culture. So the marginalized ones have the most epistemic value in her theory. Okay, so that's how I think she would respond to these questions. But I just want to give you all a chance to respond and share your thoughts after having seen that video. Like, is there anything that stood out to you or anything you maybe don't, anything that wasn't answered or that you still don't agree with?
I would say that in a nutshell, objectivity is a continuum and is aspirational. It's what we work toward.
Yeah.
But calling science democratic, we don't vote on what scientific results are. It's whatever the data shows us. Yep. And of course it can be wrong and it needs to be corrected, but the whole point of science is we're not voting on the results.
That's true. Yeah, does anyone want to speak to that point?
Yeah, I took issue with the notion of the notion of democratic, whatever it was in science, in that look at advancements. Usually the people advancing the field, or often, or at least often the people advancing the field were going against what others thought. This is for example, in early 17th century Europe, most people, you know, or kind of around 1600 in Europe, most people were thinking that, thought that the sun went around the earth rather than the other way around. And I mean, obviously that's not true, but if you took the scientific consensus at that point, that's what you would get. And once you get the first people saying otherwise, still, if you took a democratic vote, you would get that the majority of people still think the older and we know incorrect belief. So I don't think we wouldn't really get anywhere scientifically if science were democratic and we would not get anywhere if scientifically if science were democratic.
Maybe I shouldn't have used that word, but yeah, I'll just still let people contribute on that point for a minute.
Yeah, no, I agree with what he said, and I think about historically there have been women in science. Most women were busy raising their families and dying young because they died in childbirth, a lot of them, or worn out from having big families. And a lot of that came from religion, not from science. And Marie Curie's research was valuable a long time ago. We've known for a long time. Well, but hey, that she didn't get all the credit, at least for a long time or ever. And the same way with, I can't remember the lady's name who contributed a lot to the discovery of DNA. It's like the science, women in science have been there. Well, people of color have been too. That their stuff doesn't get published is a political thing, just like a lot of the other stuff. It's like there's going to be too much backlash, and if they publish it, and so don't come out with the truth. But that isn't a problem with scientific research, the scientific method, which is the basis for it. And I think the conversation is convoluted. Eugenics didn't come out of Darwin's theory. It came out of sociology that was not using scientific method to get their results. It criticized a lot as if it were Darwin, but it wasn't. And yeah, go ahead.
So I guess one of your points is that if science isn't if so-called science isn't objective, it's not real science. Real science is necessarily objective.
Well, yeah, right. I think the criticism that I'm hearing is not of science; it's of something else. It's like the results, the applications or misapplications or whatever like that, and because it's like ancient people didn't have a scientific method. They had other stuff going for them, and it didn't go very well. And so I think that's the problem. But a lot of people don't know what science is. My mother lived with me for a year and a half before she had to be in a nursing home, and she said something about she was watching a preacher on television, and I was listening, working in the kitchen, and she said something about, the teachers aren't teaching, they're teaching wrong stuff in science. And I said, well, how does that preacher know what they're teaching in school about science? And I asked my mother, who was born in 1915, she had a year of college before the Depression ran out of money. They had their family run out of money, but I asked her once about what she had learned in science or in school, because, and she thought a second and she says, well, I don't think I ever had a science class. But she's basing these conclusions on that. And if you're taking a vote of these people, we've got a problem. And so much of the perceptions are based on religion that it starts with the answers and digs in deeper the more it's criticized.
Yes, so I'll let people respond to that comment. Any responses?
Yeah, I think both Austin and Ruth are bringing up kind of two sides of the same problem, which is if it's sort of so-called common knowledge that a certain perspective is not valuable. So like if 99% of humans think that the sun, that we're revolving, the sun revolves around us, or that women's contributions to science are not worthy of being considered. For me, something like the common perception is that animals should be used for experimentation, and there's nothing wrong with that. To me, it's obvious that that's not true. I mean, I come from the opposite direction. So things get valid scientific inquiries get distorted by what the common perception of value is, I think.
I do want to note we have 5 minutes left for closing thoughts. It's been a really wonderful conversation. So let's get those closing thoughts in the next 5 minutes.
Sorry, I didn't realize that we were ending so soon. Should I respond, or do I get to say, or do I have time to say something at the end?
Yeah, let's try to get some closing thoughts, and then you can wrap it up.
Okay, sounds good.
Not your closing thoughts. Anybody else have any closing thoughts they want to share?
I'll just share one other thought, Louise and Michelle. Am I cutting somebody off here?
Go ahead, Marty.
Okay, thank you. The issue of whether science should be democratic or not, I don't think that's what Dr. Harding meant. I remember reading some of her stuff in the late 60s when I was in graduate school, and most of us in the room were white guys, and so there was a lot of reaction to it. And I was probably the only one that said, you know, the point is that you look around this room and there are people we are so underrepresented by so many people that have to eat and sleep our science, and we need to expand it. And so the research that I always participated in was always a large sample base, so we could take in large socioeconomic groups and even cross-cultural research, because I felt that if psychology, particularly in some of the other social sciences, you can't replicate the studies in other countries. And so I think it was becoming very biased, the science of psychology. And she pointed that out very early, that the recipients of all of this knowledge were not represented at the table.
Yeah.
And then Chevy, did you want to give our last comment from the audience before we go to Michelle's final thoughts?
Thank you. Yes. So in the social sciences, we refer to them as well. There is something called the Law of Unintended Consequences. So the science can cut both ways: nuclear power, nuclear weapons, and gene therapy can be very useful, but not in the sense of eugenics. Just wanted to put that little coda in there.
Okay, Michelle, can you close us up? And thank you all for joining. Let's listen to Michelle's final thoughts.
Okay, so I guess so I guess I'll just try to respond to some things that people have said from Sandra Harding's perspective as well as I can. And so yeah, maybe I shouldn't have said science is democratic, but I think that she's trying to emphasize that science should be responsive to the needs and interests of the public. So it shouldn't exploit minorities as it has historically done. Scientists should be trying to solve social problems like food shortages and droughts and climate change and things like that in the most ethical way possible. Sandra Harding, sometimes she mentions the military industrial complex quite a few times, because feminists, for example, would raise the question, should we be investing so much in basically weapons and military technology when there are people who don't have food? So is this where most of our funding for scientific research should be going, into the military industrial complex? So she thinks that some of these questions, some of these issues could be resolved. A lot of these issues could be resolved by being more responsive to the needs of marginalized groups, like the people who have the least and who have been the most underrepresented in science. So that should solve a lot of those questions. And I also wanted to say that she writes a lot about Indigenous knowledge. She actually devotes a chapter of her book to Indigenous knowledge, and she says it's important to recognize, in her view, that Indigenous people did have science. They had scientific techniques and technologies. They had complicated navigational systems, for example, and agricultural methods that were appropriated by colonizers and incorporated into Western science, but Indigenous people weren't given credit for those technologies that they had. So that's why a lot of people now are not cognizant that they had what even at the time would have been considered a type of scientific technology. And in general, Indigenous peoples' sciences and technologies, including social sciences, are not very recognized or validated. Also from the technique of many of these underrepresented groups, including Indigenous people, Western science has not been overwhelmingly positive. It has not been a story of progress because from the perspective of Indigenous philosophers, for example, they have experienced just an ongoing genocide and essentially a culture of colonialism. So so this is what happens when you don't include certain groups. To them, Western science is nothing but hostile. You know, all of Western culture is hostile. And because science exists within a colonial culture, from the perspectives of these excluded people, it's actually not good or beneficial, because these technologies have been used to reduce their populations to like 10% of the original population, you know, to just basically just destroy cultures. So so these are like the problems that Sandra Harding is trying to highlight to show that secular Western science is not necessarily good from everyone's perspective, but we could make it universally beneficial if we are responsive to these criticisms. So even scientists themselves would say that objective science, what makes it objective is, at least in part, responding to criticisms. If you cannot respond to a legitimate criticism, there's a bias there. You're not being fully objective. So if science is to be fully objective, it should respond, it should have some kind of answer to criticisms from Indigenous communities, like other communities of color, like women who are critical of, for example, reproductive science and how it has misrepresented women's reproductive organs, not invested enough in women's reproductive issues. So basically, if we want science to be more objective and better for society, we should make sure that science is responding to concerns from these communities. And I think that's what she means when she says at certain points in the book, it should be democratic. She doesn't necessarily mean that it's up to anyone to say what science, it's like the how should I put it? Like scientific research is just what anyone thinks it is, or something it's not subjective, but it just is responsive to a variety, to the widest range of legitimate criticisms as possible. That's what makes it objective. Okay, hopefully that gives like a charitable interpretation of what Sandra Harding is trying to say. And thank you all for coming, and I really enjoyed hearing your questions and comments. I can tell you already, it seems like you already have a lot of really interesting thoughts on this. So I think you've considered it before, and thanks for sharing those thoughts with me today.
Yes, and thank you to Michelle. A big round of applause. Thank you for joining our SSA conference. We have a ton of other awesome events and speakers, so please check them out.